I'm joined now by military analyst, retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Good to see you, Sean. So what is the latest on this huge explosion in Crimea, and how much damage has it done?
It was an explosion in the port of Sevastopol, home of the Black Sea Fleet. The tanks, the Russians claim that 4 tanks were destroyed. In fact, it looks like 10 vast storage facilities for fuel oil, and potentially up to 40,000 tonnes of fuel oil was destroyed. Today, although this happened yesterday morning, today it's all under control, but the Russians have claimed that Ukrainians actually did a drone strike which caused this, and they said it was mounted from Odessa, which is 250 kilometres away. That's a long way away for the drones to come. They've also claimed it was the Mugin 5 drones shown here. These are 25-kilogram warheads. They're about 5 metre wide, 3 metres long. They've got a payload about 25 kilograms, and they fly about 100 miles an hour. They only cost about £10,000. They're sourced in China, which seems a bit strange. And the one thing about this story which doesn't quite add up is that the Russians have been using these drones against the Ukrainians. So we're not quite sure at the moment whether this was actually the drone being used, but that's what the Russians have claimed. Now, individually, these are very vulnerable. But if you put them as a swarm of drones, and it looks like the Ukrainians have used 10 at a time, so the Russians air defences managed to take out some of them, 2 managed to get through. And as you see, it's the danger of having these sorts of large quantity drones that are relatively cheap and cheerful, individually not very effective, collectively can be very dangerous.
Right. Now, it's interesting that Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility for this attack. One would assume that Russia, wouldn't be targeting their own critical infrastructure either. Nevertheless, we are awaiting this spring offensive. Could this be the beginning of the opening salvo?
One of the things about this spring offensive, much vaunted, it won't start with a fanfare of trumpets and, we're off. It will almost certainly be a phased approach. And the first phase will be Ukrainians taking out lots of Russia's logistics support and things like the fuel. Where will that offensive happen? 3 main areas, possibly up into the Donbass region. The trouble is there's been fierce fighting going on there, and actually it will be very difficult to reverse that quickly. The Crimea, the trouble is that's massively reinforced, and it'll be very difficult for Ukraine to make progress there. So almost certainly it's going to be this land bridge area here where the main focus of the attack's likely to be. If Ukraine's going to be successful in these troops and equipment, 14,000 troops that have been trained in the UK have now found their way back to Ukraine. They're ready to go, and that's just the UK. Lots of international partners have also done training. And on the equipment front, NATO Secretary-General said on Thursday that 98% of the equipment that had been promised to Ukrainians has now been delivered. So that's 1,500 armoured personnel carriers, it's 230 tanks and vast quantities of ammunition. It does look like Ukrainian preparations are almost complete for that offensive.
Right, and as we know, Ukraine remains very, very tight-lipped about their operational plans. Nevertheless, as you say, they are preparing for this offensive. What do we know about how Russia's preparing for this offensive?
The one thing that they're not doing, preparing at the moment, is around Bakhmut, because the fighting there, there's still intense fighting, Russians still grinding on. We've been talking about that for 11 months. The Russians control about 87% of Bakhmut now. But away from that, it's pretty evident Russia are very nervous about what Ukraine's going to do. After all, Russia's already lost 50% of the territory that it had taken at one stage in this war. If we look at it in Crimea, there's a vast equipment storage area in Crimea. Over the last few days, that has been emptied of armoured personnel vehicles and tanks, completely emptied and redeployed. Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility, there's emplacements, actually. The Russians are putting sandbags in, reinforcing there, really worrying, because that's within the nuclear facility. They're expecting to fight there. It's worth pointing out the reactor is actually very well hardened, is fine. To the east of Zaporizhzhia, 120 kilometres of trenches, some of them visible from space, but also these dragon's teeth, which we haven't actually seen since the Second World War. They're 1 metre tall, they are a pyramid in function, and they're made of concrete. They're just designed to slow down main battle tanks, and they're being used all over the place. This is old footage from last year, but it still shows the valid. I mean, the very fact that we've not been talking about the war in Ukraine for the last week doesn't mean there's not a lot going on behind the scenes, and there's definitely a storm brewing.
OK, Sean, always good to see you. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.